afternoon. My name is Esther Murphy and I've been privileged to work with AHEAD and NLN on this piece of research. Today's presentation is focused on looking at the benefits of UDL specifically for students with mental health difficulties. And this presentation represents a component piece of a larger piece of research that was conducted with higher education institutes and students with mental health difficulties over the last year. And we launched it back in November, so if people are interested in the full report, that can be accessed on AHEAD's website. So just to give you a brief overview of the research that we carried out. So why did we do the research and how the research was conducted, and specifically for today's presentation, looking at how applying UDL principles can benefit students with mental health difficulties, and then some of our recommendations based on this. So firstly, why did we want to look specifically at what was the supports available for students with mental health difficulties in our higher education institutions? So the piece of research was really informed about what already was out there, what was the landscape like, and what we have information on is the increasing rise in numbers of students with mental health difficulties accessing higher education institutes. And as an earlier presentation from Julie and Declan highlighted, that there has been particularly an increase in students with disabilities over the last number of years, and in particular students with mental health difficulties as well. However, this hasn't been matched necessarily with the funding supports, so there's been a bit of a struggle in terms of the professional response to this increase. In particular, to draw your attention to the My World survey, which was carried out with UCD and Headstrong, which was a really comprehensive picture of the experience for students and young people with mental health difficulties in Ireland. And key finding around that was related to the need for one good adult to support students and young people. So just to say, this was some of the context of why we would look at this particular group of students. And the questions in particular, I know listening to Frederick earlier, the emphasis on, we're all converted here to UDL here, we are all interested in looking at inclusive practices. And today, I suppose, the message really is to look at, why the positives work, so then we can present that as an argument really for including UDL in our campuses. And particularly, we want to look at these positive stories. For students with mental health difficulties, what's working well to support them? While we may be aware of some of the things that aren't working so well, could we hone in on areas of good practice and example? And then look at how these students could be better supported based on that knowledge. So looking at how the research was conducted itself. Firstly, we carried out a survey monkey, then semi-structured interviews and focus groups. The survey was designed in collaboration with our steering committee. We had members from the Irish Association of Counsellors, and also we worked with NLN as well in developing these questions. And our questionnaire was disseminated widely to all 28 higher education institutes, and we were grateful to receive 22 responses from the higher education sector. But also to say that in terms of completing a survey, we did leave quite a good bit of space for people to engage with qualitative feedback, and this was also incorporated into the qualitative analysis. And also to say that there was a lovely interaction between the higher education institutes and myself as the researcher on the project, in that people emailed me afterwards, phoned me. They wanted to really give as comprehensive feedback as possible, and in which case they were invited to take part in the qualitative aspect of the work. So firstly, we had two focus groups. They were rather in-depth focus groups. There was scheduled kind of a 2-hour session. And again, the engagement from both professionals and students was really amazing, really positive. People wanted to stay beyond the 2 hours. We tried to facilitate that as much as possible and continue the conversation even after the focus groups. So for the professionals, we had 7 professionals take part and 11 students. And to say in the professional group, there were representatives from disability services, counsellors and occupational therapists as well. And in the student group, there was really an amazing diversity of students in terms of subjects that they were studying, in terms of age group. In fact, there were mature students taking part as well, and also students with other difficulties as well as having a mental health difficulty. And the semi-structured interviews, the reason for pursuing this particular method as well was to ensure that we included other professionals and students who perhaps, which may be considered with more severe difficulties that didn't feel comfortable perhaps taking part in a focus group, would also have their opportunity to have their voice included in the work. And what were our findings? So today, as I said, for really more in-depth understanding of what we found out, I'd refer you to the report. Today we're very much focused on looking at findings that relate to the UDL principles, because what we did, stepping back from this in a later analysis, I was really looking at the findings to see, actually there were really strong alignment with UDL principles. So, at this point in the conference, we're so familiar, and indeed even prior to arriving here, people are very familiar with the concepts of the UDL principles. So just looking today, I was going to speak to some data around the alignment with the variability of engagement and the whole college response. I know that Julie mentioned this earlier as a key recommendation in their piece of work. And also variability of representation, so that corresponds to having inclusive teaching and learning practices. And finally, variability of action, looking at flexibility in assessment. So firstly, looking at variability of engagement. So I'm just going to give you some insights from the data. So in terms of, this is a quote here from an IoT counsellor who refers to this whole campus response in her college, where mental health is included in the induction, right? The preliminary engagement with students. So the induction is very even. So you're introduced to the academic staff, the career staff, disability staff, and counselling staff. All those services are laid out to you as being equally accessible, and all the different ways to engage with support across the campus. So this was, we kind of pinned this as a really good practice, where students who may be arriving to college with mental health difficulties, or even those without that may progress through college and experience mental health difficulty, they were welcomed. In their welcome, there was mention of mental health difficulties, where they could seek support, and the various ways in which they could do this kind of multiple variety options of engagement. And so, particularly interested to kind of draw out what would an experience like that, how would that impact a student? How would they experience that? So I'm picking out an experience here from an IoT student who says that she had experience of mental health being included in the induction and a clear roadmap where she could seek supports. So her experience, she says, during induction, in the very first few weeks, she introduced herself and said, "This is where I'm based," explained that she was there for students, and I said to myself, I need to introduce myself, so I made an appointment. Just to say, this particular student also highlighted other ways in which she could seek support on campus, but this was one that worked right at the beginning in induction. So a really nice example of that UDL principle in practice. But just to say, that in that example, they weren't referring to UDL. I think that's been a conversation at this conference as well, that sometimes people are adopting and embracing UDL without even using the term. So on the flip side, so while, the emphasis is really to hone in on the positive, again, in this kind of our case going forward to promote UDL, it's nice to be able to say, well, this is a really good example of where it works. But in a case for somebody with mental health difficulties, it might not just be a case of they can't engage in the class, it can actually impact an already existing mental health difficulty. So for instance, this student refers to nobody ever actually talked about mental health and the sort of services that are available. I really struggled to get help I began to disengage, and eventually the student actually dropped out. Another student mentions, it took me ages to find out about what support I could get to help with my mental health. I suppose ultimately they found out by word of mouth, little highlights around the college. It wasn't, I suppose, a unified message. Different ways to find out where to get information support would have helped me. Finally, this is an occupational therapist at a university who mentions, everybody in colleges, including the academics and people at the top, should take some sort of responsibility for ensuring the well-being of all students. Whole campus response is needed and shouldn't be optional. So just to say, this research is really driven by the data, so the recommendations are really driven by the words of the participants. So these kind of terms like whole campus response are coming from the participants themselves, the need for it. And I feel that kind of really echoes what we've heard earlier this morning as well, the need for a whole campus responsibility and response. And the benefit for that for all students. You know, it's critical, it's kind of more knife-edge stuff you may be dealing with students with mental health difficulties, but this has benefits for all students. And turning to the second principle around variability of representation. So again, it's looking at this idea of teaching and learning inclusive practices. And so while this is considered a good practice for students with mental health difficulties, this has an amazing advantage of actually helping reduce existing anxiety and stress. As this student says, it's nice to see that some lecturers are more aware of people's different abilities and showing ways of being able to do particular exams in a quicker way. So this guy, he's speaking about one of his lecturers in mechanical engineering, and this he refers to this. So this guy was very gifted at what he does. When he came to the workshop, they would have the tools, a special tool rack designed for me, so I didn't need to constantly put the tools down and lose them and jumble them up. It reduces the amount of anxiety you feel. The less anxious you are, the less chance you have of getting depressed. In the other college, he was basically, and to say that, you know, practically half of the participants in the focus group had had multiple college experiences and had dropped out and returned to college, which wouldn't be unusual for that group of students, really. The less anxious you are, the less chance you have of getting depressed. In the other college, no support like that, and he ended up dropping out. So what I really like is the creativity here. But I suppose a real message here is that you're relying on, as people have said, maybe those advocates, those ambassadors, the champions of these inclusive practices. And this student feels that he was very fortunate. There's a lot of gratitude expressed to the lecturers who they feel are going above and beyond, whereas we know we're talking about systemic change and the need to look at this at a higher level and the responsibility of sharing these practices so that everybody can kind of rely on it. And I think, again, I'm referring to the earlier discussion about the patchiness. So again, today I'm kind of cherry picking some good examples because really in the wider survey there was evidence really of quite ad hoc practices and not being able to depend from one college to the next for the similar types of supports. So again, this has been a theme of the conference as well around sharing things online. So this student refers to not every lecturer likes to put their stuff up online, and that can be a big problem for people who can't attend a class. In this particular student's case, he had experienced severe mental health difficulty in his first year in college, and just before Christmas he had to leave college and was in hospital. And when he was coming back, the closest relationship he had made was with his personal tutor, not with the disability service. So when he went to try and access his course material, it wasn't available. So it was because he had this relationship with his personal tutor who advocated on his behalf to get the materials, which he did, and he ultimately did get the materials. But again, it's relying on that one individual. And what's the impact for someone's mental health of these lack of inclusive practices? So again, this is another situation where someone had to drop out due to attending a hospital. they needed more support to catch up for the recording of lecture notes. It's just not looked at, having a mental health problem is something that needs that support. When you're going through this, you need as much help as you can get, or it can make you feel worse. So that's really the strong message with this, I really feel, is that it's the fact that it's not about just leveling the playing field. It can actually make someone's mental health deteriorate to a point where they will drop out of college because of this lack of support. Finally, the final UDL principle around variability of action and expression. So there's, taking with the one point around flexibility in assessment, there were other examples within the data, but particularly looking at this assessment piece, and it was a very important part of this morning's keynote, is that for many of the students that we spoke with and professionals, the area of making a presentation in front of their class was just nerve-wracking, like really, really stressful and really stress-inducing, and caused people to miss classes and also then not be assessed at all by refusing to do it. So a disability, this was recognised by professionals, as a disability officer mentioned, huge levels of anxiety about the oral presentations, and as they go on to say, on one-to-one with the lecturer, where they just go in and present to somebody, or they record themselves presenting in their room at home, and they're still doing the presentation, and they're just not doing it with the audience. So the message here is around that flexibility, so that again, it was the ownership of the one lecturer being flexible, rather it being driven by the policy within the college, and this having a huge benefit for the student, in which in one case the student refers to being a nervous wreck, and it made all the difference to me to record the presentation, and a chance to really show what I learnt by being given this flexible option. So again, in the focus group, like I say, it was quite a lengthy focus group. We ran for almost 2.5 hours, and people engaged afterwards, and people really wanted AHEAD and myself as a researcher to take away really solid recommendations. So one of the key points from our discussion was around the change in policy around alternative assessment, and a solid recommendation be made. I'm talking about a student being at home and recording the presentation. This person says, I mean, that's all very well. You have one cooperative member of staff who agrees to that, and the guy in the next school can't have it. That seems wrong. So really, in terms of moving to what our recommendations are, again, if I could have the slides of the Dawn network and pop that up there, because obviously working with AHEAD, we're very much linked and in sync with the work that Dawn are doing in the recommendations in terms of being strategic with this going forward. But just to say that one particular IoT counsellor mentioned, and again, these may be individual data points, individual quotes, but they were very representative, because in a focus group there was a lot of consensus on the points and a lot of teasing out of the issues. So the quotes selected are because they're quite representative. This person says, embracing UDL is helpful for all learners. For students with mental health difficulties, it can be the difference between reaching their potential or without it making their mental health problems worse. So it's quite a powerful piece for these students, but also for the benefit for all students. And just to wrap up by saying there, the real message of embracing UDL, the whole campus multi-agency approach that's needed, again, strategically aligning with the work that's happening in the HEA, and as we heard from Geraldine this morning as well in terms of the assessment, and the policy change to embed variability and flexibility into teaching, learning and assessment methods. And finally, our next steps at the moment, just to, since we launched, since we launched the report, there have been discussions about developing a key stakeholders seminar to spotlight on mental health, and we're looking at that before the summer. So we'll keep you posted, and thanks so much. Should you wish to explore the report in more detail, it's on AHEAD's website, and we recently published in the European Journal of Special Needs Education. So thanks very much for listening.
Does anyone want to raise a question? There's one down
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was great, and the way you integrated student voice. I have maybe not a question, even a comment, see if you've experienced this, but my experience with instructors and faculty with regards to mental health and having discourse about changing assessment or adapting pedagogy, with mental health brings up the specific issue that often people will feel quite comfortable saying, I'm preparing them for the real world. There's a lot of stress out there. They're going to have to deal with this anyway, so why should I change my methods? Where I'm really just being a gatekeeper. I'm making sure they don't go forward if they can't actually face the kind of stress, the kind of anxiety they're going to face later. So I thought that was really insidious because it's really hard to change that culture of like, this is not your concern, you're teaching skills, that's it. You know, like you're not a sort of gatekeeper to the real world.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a fine line, and I suppose we all have mental health, you know. That's really important to say from the outset. And in terms of managing our stress, I mean, listening to Geraldine this morning in terms of assessment and overload, I think it's important to align supporting students with mental health difficulties with all students, you know. And in terms of addressing concerns that lecturers may have, I think, you know, we have a toolkit with UDL to say that it's about variability, you know, giving people options. I also think that, you know, I was just presenting certain points within, you know, giving one example for each UDL principal, but even looking at the engagement space. You know, on campuses right now, there are one-to-one supports. So ideally, you'd be thinking of a combined effort, you know, where there are some one-to-one as well in the cases of people who have really quite severe difficulties, or indeed, as our report goes into more detail, the responsibility also falling with health professionals as well. If a young person, a student, is also under the care of the health service executive, where do their responsibility lies? It's a complex space. But in terms of addressing lecturers, I would think that I thought that Geraldine's presentation earlier, which referred to kind of incremental learning, you know, as well, and not maybe diving in straight with an oral presentation when somebody is feeling, you know, when somebody has expressed, you know, specific concerns, increased anxiety around that. I think, you know, it's flexible approaches to examining that with the lecturer. But it comes back to that this needs to be at a top tier level, you know, that it needs to be driven by the policy, that lecturers know and are aware that there will be students with diverse needs in their class, and therefore there must be diverse approaches and responses to those needs. Thanks.
Again, yeah, it was a very enjoyable talk again. But just on the whole thing there, a lot of what you're talking about were actually still would be classed as accommodations rather than universal design. Like, for example, giving the one student the opportunity to use a recording rather than a talk. In your experience, have you come up against what we say is more universal design, where people were given multiple options with regard to assessment?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, these were the particular issues that presented for this group. I have to say, within the group, there was a lot of emphasis around the oral presentation and ways to kind of accommodate students to do their best with this, but also to say that within the multiple engagement means there were, you know, add-on services within colleges, like, for instance, NLN services offer academic and social supports together to support students in terms of building their confidence and self-esteem and working with them to overcome the anxiety, to be able to present. So it wasn't kind of a one-size-fits-all with it, really. Thanks. Thanks, William. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther.